Let me set the stage for you. Picture this. I'm 22, fresh out of college, full of big dreams, and completely in love with a woman who could light up the darkest room with just a smile. Let's call her Amber. Not because it's her real name, but because she sparkled like a jewel in the beginning. Amber had this energy about her, a magnetic force that pulled people in and made them stay. The kind of girl who could convince you to do tequila shots on a Tuesday night and still get to work on time the next morning. She loved the night. Clubs, parties, live music, you name it, she was there. The bass thumping through the floor, the multicolored lights dancing on her skin, the laughter of strangers. It was her element. She didn't just blend into the scene. She was the scene. Guys would line up to buy her drinks, and I'd be standing there like a proud idiot, thinking, yeah, that's my girl. It wasn't that I hated her love for nightlife. I even joined her at first. The problem was, Amber didn't know when to stop. What started as a weekend thing quickly turned into late-night escapades 3 or 4 times a week. I'd come home after a long day at work, hoping to spend some quiet time with her, only to find her rifling through her closet, picking out another little black dress. "Babe, come with me tonight," she'd say, flashing me that smile that could melt glaciers. "It'll be fun." But fun wasn't what I needed after 12-hour shifts. I'd politely decline, and she'd pout for a moment before shrugging it off. "Suit yourself," she'd say, and off she went, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air long after the door clicked shut. At first, I trusted her completely. I didn't even think twice when she'd roll in at 3 a.m., still buzzing from the adrenaline of the night. She'd crawl into bed next to me, muttering something about how wild it was, and I'd go back to sleep. But as the weeks turned into months, little cracks started forming in the foundation of my trust. Her stories didn't always add up. "How was the club?" I'd ask. "Oh, it was great. I stayed with Chloe the whole night," she'd reply, but Chloe's Instagram would tell a different story. She'd been at home binge-watching Netflix. Then came the night that changed everything. Amber walked through the door at some ungodly hour, looking more disheveled than usual. Her makeup was smudged, her hair a little messy, and her dress slightly askew. But the thing that caught my eye, no, the thing that made my heart sink, was the mark on her neck. A dark, unmistakable mark. "What's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She blinked at me, confused for a moment, and then touched her neck. "Oh, this?" she said, brushing it off with a laugh. "I burned myself with the curling iron." "The curling iron? Really?" I might have been a little naive, but I wasn't stupid. That wasn't a burn. It was a mark, the kind someone leaves on you when they've crossed a line. My stomach twisted into a knot. "Amber?" I said, my voice quieter this time. "Are you sure that's what happened?" She rolled her eyes. "Don't be ridiculous, babe. You know I'd never do anything like that." But her laugh was forced, and her eyes wouldn't meet mine. I didn't push it that night. I didn't have the energy. I just nodded, turned away, and stared at the ceiling for hours, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. "Amber, we need to talk," I said as we sat at the breakfast table. "About what?" she asked, her tone defensive before I'd even said a word. "That mark," I said. "It's not adding up. You can't expect me to believe it's from a curling iron." Her face flushed red, and she stood up abruptly. "Are you serious right now? Do you even hear yourself? You're being paranoid." "Am I?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Because if the roles were reversed, you'd be asking the same thing." The argument spiraled from there. She accused me of not trusting her, of being controlling, of trying to ruin her fun. I accused her of being careless, of disrespecting our relationship, of not valuing what we had. By the time the dust settled, we were both emotionally drained. I didn't know who she was anymore, or maybe I didn't know who I'd become. Either way, I couldn't stay. That same day, I packed a bag and left. It wasn't a grand, dramatic exit. I didn't slam the door or shout a goodbye. I just gathered what I needed, wrote her a short note that said, "I need some space," and walked out. I had no idea at the time that this was only the beginning of a much darker, more complicated chapter. But for now, all I knew was that the woman I loved had turned into a stranger, and I couldn't bear to be around her anymore. A week. That's all it took for my carefully constructed sense of resolve to come crashing down like a Jenga tower. It had been 7 days since I walked out of Amber's life. 7 days of silence, unanswered calls, and long, lonely nights at my buddy Mark's place, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd made the right decision. And then she showed up. It was late in the evening, and I was nursing a lukewarm beer, half watching some random show Mark had put on. The knock on the door startled me. Mark glanced at me, eyebrows raised, as if to say, "Expecting anyone?" I wasn't. When I opened the door, there she was, Amber. Her makeup-free face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red as if she'd been crying for hours. She was clutching her arms like they were the only thing holding her together. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice shaky and small. I wanted to say no, to tell her to leave, but the words caught in my throat. So instead, I stepped aside and let her in. She didn't waste time on small talk. As soon as she sat down, she blurted it out. "I'm pregnant." The words hit me like a freight train. I just stared at her, trying to process what she'd said. Pregnant? It didn't make sense, and yet it did. My brain immediately jumped to a million questions, but the only one I managed to choke out was, "Are you sure?" She nodded, her hands trembling as they clutched at the hem of her sweater. "I took 3 tests," she said, her voice cracking. "I went to the doctor this morning to confirm. I felt the room spinning." "How far along?" "About 6 weeks," she whispered. 6 weeks. The timeline checked out. This wasn't some desperate attempt to manipulate me. It was real. A cocktail of emotions surged through me. Fear, confusion, anger, but also something else. Hope. A tiny, fragile flicker of hope. Maybe this was the universe's way of giving us a second chance. "I know I screwed up," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you, and you have every right to hate me. But this changes everything." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Please, let's try again. For the baby." I sat there in silence, staring at her. She looked so vulnerable, so unlike the confident, carefree Amber I'd known. For the first time in weeks, I saw not the person who'd hurt me but the person I'd fallen in love with. And like the fool I was, I said yes. The next few months were a whirlwind. We didn't just get back together. We practically reinvented ourselves as a couple. We started fresh, wiping the slate clean, or at least pretending to. Amber moved in with me, and we threw ourselves into creating the kind of stable, loving environment we thought our child deserved. Our relationship, which had been built on shaky foundations, suddenly felt solid for the first time. Amber quit her clubbing habit overnight, swapping late-night parties for prenatal yoga classes and evenings spent on the couch binge-watching baby-related documentaries. I watched as the wild, unpredictable girl I'd fallen for transformed into a devoted, soon-to-be mother. As for me, I threw myself into work, determined to save up as much as possible before the baby arrived. I wanted to give them everything: a nice home, a safe neighborhood, a chance at a good life. And every time I came home to Amber, curled up with baby books or scribbling down nursery ideas, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. We even started therapy, couples counseling, to be exact. At first, it felt awkward, sitting across from a stranger and airing our dirty laundry. But as the weeks went by, it became something I looked forward to. We learned how to talk to each other, how to really listen. Communication is the foundation of a healthy relationship, our therapist, Dr. Carter, would say. And for a while, we actually believed her. It wasn't always smooth sailing, of course. There were still moments of tension, leftover scraps of resentment from the past. But every time we argued, we'd remind ourselves of the baby growing inside her. This wasn't just about us anymore. I remember the first ultrasound like it was yesterday, sitting in that cramped, dimly lit room, holding Amber's hand as the technician moved the wand over her belly. And then, there it was, the faint, flickering heartbeat of our child. Amber squeezed my hand, her eyes filling with tears. "That's our baby," she whispered, her voice full of awe. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. In that moment, all my doubts melted away. This was real. We were going to be parents. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely happy. We started planning everything, the nursery, the name, even what schools we'd send them to. We were a team united by this tiny, beating heart. Looking back, it's almost laughable how naive I was. But at the time, I didn't care. I was ready to fight for this new life we were building. Little did I know, the cracks were still there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to tear everything apart. I'll admit, when Amber suggested we get married, I hesitated for a moment. Not because I didn't want to, of course I did. I loved her and I wanted to believe in our fresh start. But there was this little voice in the back of my mind, whispering doubts I couldn't fully ignore. Was this too soon? Were we really ready for a lifelong commitment? But then I looked at her, at the glow in her eyes and the way her hand rested protectively over her small but growing belly, and the doubts melted away. She was carrying our child. We were a family already. The wedding was just a formality. We kept it simple. No lavish venue, no 100-person guest list. Just close friends and family. A sunny day at the local park, and vows that felt like promises we could keep. Amber looked radiant in her white dress, her growing bump just barely visible beneath the fabric. And when she said, "I do," I believed her. I believed in us. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. After the wedding, life shifted into overdrive. I took on extra hours at work, even a second job on weekends for a while. Amber wanted to stay home with the baby once they were born, and I was determined to make that happen. I didn't mind the long hours. It felt like I was working towards something bigger than myself. Amber, meanwhile, was settling into her role as a mother. She spent her days preparing for the baby, taking parenting classes, and turning our little apartment into a cozy nest. She even started cooking, something she'd barely done before. I came home one evening to the smell of lasagna wafting through the air and found her in the kitchen, beaming proudly over her latest creation. "Look at me," she joked, wiping tomato sauce off her cheek. Domestic goddess in training. I laughed and kissed her on the forehead. "You're amazing," I said, and I meant it. When our first child, Lily, was born, it was like the world stood still. I'll never forget the moment I held her for the first time, her tiny fingers curling around mine. Amber looked up at me from the hospital bed, exhausted but glowing with pride. "She's perfect," Amber whispered, and I nodded, unable to find words. Those first few months were a blur of sleepless nights, diaper changes, and endless bottles. But I didn't mind. Every cry, every coo, every tiny milestone felt like a victory. We were a team figuring it out together. As time went on, our little family began to settle into a rhythm. I worked hard, and Amber stayed home with Lily, who was growing like a weed and keeping us on our toes. Life wasn't perfect. There were still arguments here and there, moments when stress got the better of us, but overall, things were good. 2 years flew by in what felt like the blink of an eye, and then Amber hit me with another surprise. We were sitting on the couch one evening, watching some reality show she loved but I could barely tolerate, when she turned to me with that mischievous grin she always had when she was about to say something big. "So," she began, drawing out the word. I glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "So, I took a test today," she said, biting her lip to hide her smile. My heart skipped a beat. "A test?" She nodded, pulling a little plastic stick out of her pocket and holding it up. "Positive." I blinked at it, then at her. "You're pregnant." "Surprise," she said, laughing at my stunned expression. For a moment I just sat there, processing the news. Then I pulled her into my arms, laughing along with her. "We're having another baby," I said, the words feeling surreal. Amber's second pregnancy was a little tougher than the first. She was more tired this time, more irritable. I chalked it up to the added stress of taking care of Lily while carrying another child, but I tried to do everything I could to make it easier for her. I picked up even more hours at work, brought home takeout on the nights she didn't feel like cooking, and took over bedtime duties with Lily so Amber could rest. Despite the challenges, there were still moments of joy. I remember the first time Lily felt the baby kick. Her eyes lit up with wonder, and she kept pressing her little hands against Amber's belly, waiting for it to happen again. "Is it a boy or a girl?" Lily asked one night as we tucked her into bed. "We don't know yet," Amber replied, smoothing Lily's hair. "I want a sister," Lily declared with the kind of certainty only a toddler can muster. Amber laughed. "Well, we'll see what the baby decides to be." When our second child, Noah, was born, it felt like our family was finally complete. He was the spitting image of Amber, with her dark hair and big brown eyes, and he had this calm, sweet demeanor that made everyone fall in love with him instantly. Life with 2 kids was chaotic, to say the least. The house was always a mess, and it felt like there were never enough hours in the day. But in those rare quiet moments, Lily reading a picture book while Noah dozed on Amber's chest, it all felt worth it. For a while, everything seemed perfect. I was exhausted but happy, working hard to provide for my family, while Amber poured herself into raising our children. We were a team again, stronger than ever, or so I thought, because even in those moments of bliss, the cracks were still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for their chance to widen. But at the time I was too busy, too tired, and maybe too hopeful to notice. Life has a way of lulling you into a sense of security right before it pulls the rug out from under you. For years, I thought we had built something unshakable. Amber and I had survived our rough patches, grown stronger as a team, and brought 2 beautiful kids into the world. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. At first, it was subtle. Amber started spending more time running errands. A quick trip to the store for milk would turn into 2 hours of silence. Her phone conveniently left in the car when I tried to call. "Sorry, the lines were crazy," she'd say, breezing into the house with bags in hand. I wanted to believe her, so I did. Why wouldn't I? She was my wife, the mother of my children. But then it became more frequent. The grocery trips stretched longer, and new patterns started to emerge. Weekly girls' nights, unexplained absences, and a sudden fixation on her appearance. She started wearing makeup more often, even for casual outings, and bought herself a new wardrobe that leaned heavily on form-fitting dresses and high heels. I tried not to read too much into it. After all, she deserved to feel good about herself. She was a stay-at-home mom juggling 2 energetic kids, and if a little self-care helped her feel better, who was I to question it? The first time I heard one of the late-night phone calls, I didn't think much of it. It was past midnight, and I was getting up to grab a glass of water when I noticed the faint glow of Amber's phone screen through the crack in our bedroom door. I know," she whispered, her voice low but urgent. "It's just been so hard lately. You don't understand how much I need this." I froze, straining to hear more, but her voice dropped even further, the words muffled. For a moment, I considered barging in and demanding to know who she was talking to, but I stopped myself. Amber had always been close to her friends, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. The next morning, over breakfast, I casually brought it up. "You were on the phone pretty late last night," I said, pouring coffee into my mug. Amber didn't miss a beat. "Oh, that was Sarah," she said, referring to her oldest friend. "She's been having a rough time with her divorce. I didn't want to wake you." I nodded, letting it slide. Of course, she was helping Sarah. Amber had always been a good friend, the kind of person people turn to in a crisis. But then it happened again, and again. The late-night calls became a regular occurrence, and each time, it was another friend with another problem. At least, that's what she told me. I started to notice other changes too. Amber, who used to share every detail of her day with me, was suddenly more private. She'd lock her phone or flip it face down whenever I walked into the room. Conversations felt more surface level, as if she were holding something back. One night, as we lay in bed, I tried to bring it up. "Is everything okay?" I asked, turning to face her. She glanced at me, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean? You just seem distant lately," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Like there's something on your mind." Amber sighed, rolling onto her side. "It's nothing," she said. "I'm just tired, that's all. Between the kids and everything else, I barely have time to breathe. I wanted to believe her, so I let it go. But the nagging feeling in my gut refused to be silenced. The turning point came one evening when Amber announced she was going out for dinner with her friends. "Don't wait up," she said, grabbing her purse and checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. I glanced up from where I was playing Legos with Noah and Lily. "Which friends?" "Sarah and a couple of the girls from book club," she said casually, not meeting my eyes. "Book club? I didn't know you joined a book club," I said, trying to sound neutral. "It's new," she replied, her tone clipped. "Anyway, don't make a big deal out of it. I'll be back late." She kissed the kids goodbye and was out the door before I could say anything else. That night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. Something about the way she'd avoided eye contact, the way she'd brushed off my questions. It didn't sit right. The next morning, I asked her how the dinner went. "Oh, it was fun," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "We talked about the book and just caught up on life." "What book?" I asked, curious. She froze for half a second, just long enough for me to notice. The Nightingale," she said, naming a bestseller I'd seen on our bookshelf but never noticed her reading. I forced a smile, pretending not to catch the hesitation in her voice. Sounds like a good time. But deep down, I knew. The late nights, the phone calls, the locked screen. None of it was adding up. Something was wrong. And no matter how much I wanted to bury my head in the sand, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Amber was slipping away from me, and for the first time, I felt powerless to stop it. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. The kind of evening that feels so ordinary, you'd never expect your entire life to unravel in a matter of seconds. I had come home late from work, as usual. The house was calm, too calm. Amber was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, the soft glow of the screen reflecting off her face. Noah and Lily were in the living room, their laughter echoing faintly as they played with the new board game Amber had insisted we buy. Everything seemed so normal. "Dinner's in the oven," Amber said without looking up, her tone flat, almost robotic. "Thanks," I muttered, setting down my briefcase and loosening my tie. Exhaustion weighed heavy on my shoulders, but I was used to it. Providing for my family had become my purpose, my identity. I was on my way upstairs to change when I heard Amber's voice, quiet but deliberate. I froze mid-step, my heart skipping a beat. "Listen," she was saying, her tone low, almost conspiratorial. "You can't tell him. He doesn't need to know." My brow furrowed. I leaned against the wall out of sight, straining to hear. "Mommy, why?" Lily's sweet, innocent voice replied, laced with confusion. "Because," Amber said firmly, her voice tinged with irritation. "He doesn't need to know that he's not your real father. Not until you're in college. He'll take care of us until then, but it's better this way." The words hit me like a wrecking ball. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Knocking the air from my lungs. I felt my knees weaken, my head spinning as her voice echoed in my mind. "He's not your real father. He'll take care of us." For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. It was as if time had frozen, the walls closing in around me. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tightening under the weight of what I'd just heard. Not their real father. It didn't make sense. Couldn't. Lily and Noah were my world, my reason for everything. Every late night, every extra shift, every penny I'd poured into private schools, music lessons, and sports clubs. It had all been for them. For my children. I wanted to storm into the room, to demand an explanation, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. Instead, I slid down the wall, sitting there in stunned silence. My hands trembled as I pressed them to my face, my mind racing through every moment of our lives together, searching for signs I'd missed. And then it hit me, the insistence on the best schools, no matter the cost. The countless emergencies that required new clothes, expensive gifts, or last-minute trips. The way Amber always pushed for more, more, more. I thought she was just being a good mother, wanting the best for her kids. But now the truth was staring me in the face. I wasn't a husband. I wasn't even a partner. I was a walking wallet. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Anger and heartbreak churned in my chest, battling for dominance. I felt hollow, betrayed. I thought back to the day Lily was born, the overwhelming joy I'd felt as I held her tiny hand in mine, the pride that swelled in my chest when Noah took his first steps, the bedtime stories, the scraped knees I'd patched up, the countless, "I love you, Daddy" moments that had become the fabric of my existence. Had it all been a lie? A sharp pain shot through my chest as the realization sank deeper. Amber had known. She'd known all along, and she'd let me live this lie for years. Not only that, she'd used me. She'd built a life around my sacrifices, my devotion, all while keeping this terrible secret. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was shattered. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark hallway, my back pressed against the cold wall. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed meaningless. All I could think about was the life I thought I'd had, the family I thought I'd built, and how it had all been ripped away in an instant. Eventually, I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. I needed answers. I needed to know how Amber could do this, how she could lie to me, to our children, for so long. But as I walked back downstairs, my steps heavy and deliberate, I paused. Amber's voice drifted toward me again, light and carefree as if nothing had happened. "Okay, kids, time for bed," she called, laughter in her tone. And just like that, the confrontation I'd been rehearsing in my head dissolved. The words caught in my throat, replaced by a suffocating sense of futility. What was the point? Would she even care? Instead, I retreated to the spare room, locking the door behind me. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own home. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me like an anchor. I had given Amber everything. My love, my trust, my hard work. And in return, she had turned me into nothing more than a means to an end. I wasn't just hurt. I was broken. And the worst part? I had no idea what to do next. Morning came far too soon, dragging me from a restless, sleepless night. The house was quiet, too quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt oppressive, the weight of it pressing against my chest as I sat up in the spare room. I didn't bother showering or even brushing my teeth. My mind was set on one thing: leaving. I couldn't spend another minute under the same roof as Amber. I dragged the largest suitcase we owned from the back of the closet, its wheels creaking as I rolled it into the room. At first, I tried to pack methodically, folding shirts and lining up shoes like I was preparing for a vacation. But halfway through, my emotions took over. Anger, heartbreak, disbelief. All of it came rushing back in a tidal wave. I grabbed fistfuls of clothes, shoving them into the suitcase without care. Socks, jeans, jackets, it didn't matter. If it was mine and within reach, it went in. My hands trembled as I zipped the suitcase shut, my knuckles white with the effort. The kids' toys in the living room caught my eye as I wheeled the suitcase to the door. A stuffed giraffe Lily adored. The little model car Noah had painstakingly built with me last Christmas. For a moment, I froze, overwhelmed by a crushing sense of loss. They weren't just objects. They were pieces of a life I thought was real. I wanted to take them. I wanted to believe I could hold onto those memories without the pain that came with them. But I couldn't. Not yet. Amber was still asleep when I left. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she heard the front door click shut, the sound of the suitcase wheels on the pavement as I loaded it into the trunk of my car. Either way, I didn't care. My first stop was my friend Mark's place. He'd been my confidant for years, the kind of guy who'd drop everything to help you. No questions asked. Mark opened the door, his face scrunching in confusion at the sight of me standing there with a suitcase at 7 a.m. "What's going on?" he asked. "I need a place to crash," I said, my voice hoarse. He didn't press for details. He just stepped aside and said, "Come in." Once I was settled, if you could call sitting on his couch with my head in my hands, settled, I made the next call. My lawyer, Andrew, had handled everything from my taxes to minor disputes over the years. But this was different. Andrew, I said when he picked up, my voice shaking. I need your help. I laid it all out for him. The overheard conversation, the years of lies, the kids who weren't mine. I spared no detail, my words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. First things first, Andrew said, his tone calm but firm. We'll start by filing for divorce. And if the paternity fraud is as clear-cut as you say, we can press charges. I want them out of my house, I said, my voice low. That's doable, but we need to follow the proper steps, Andrew replied. I'll draft the paperwork today. In the meantime, get your finances in order. Protect yourself. I hung up the phone and stared at it for a long time. Divorce. Fraud. Words that felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else's life. But they were my reality now. Over the next few days, I buried myself in paperwork. Financial statements, birth certificates, medical records. I scrutinized every line, every detail, looking for anything that might strengthen my case. The hardest part was the birth certificates. Seeing my name listed as the father brought a lump to my throat. I'd signed those papers with pride, believing I was starting a legacy. Now they were just evidence of a lie. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. Memories flashed before me. Lily's first steps, Noah's first words, bedtime stories, and scraped knees. All of it felt tainted now, like a cruel joke at my expense. Amber had betrayed me on every level. Not just as a wife, but as a partner, a friend, and a person I'd trusted with my heart and my life. She'd come home with lies on her lips and marks on her neck, and I'd forgiven her. Again and again. How could someone you loved so deeply turn around and destroy you so completely? Mark tried to cheer me up, offering beers and bad jokes, but I was too numb to appreciate it. My thoughts kept drifting back to Amber, to the kids, to the life I was leaving behind. She's not worth it, Mark said one evening, handing me a drink. She's not, I agreed, but the pain in my chest didn't care about logic. For years, I'd worked myself to the bone to give Amber and the kids everything they wanted. And for what? To be used? To be lied to? Sitting there on that couch, surrounded by boxes of documents and half-formed plans, I made a vow to myself. I wouldn't let her win. I wouldn't let her rewrite our story to make me the fool. Amber may have broken me, but I wasn't staying broken. Not for her. Not for anyone. The divorce proceedings were brutal. I went into it thinking the hardest part would be filing the papers, but I underestimated how deeply Amber's betrayal had cut me. Every step of the process felt like ripping off a bandage, only to find the wound underneath was still raw and bleeding. Andrew, my lawyer, wasted no time. He filed for divorce, citing infidelity and fraud, and initiated the paternity fraud lawsuit in the same breath. He was meticulous, relentless, and, as Amber would later describe him during one of her outbursts, a complete shark. Good. That's exactly what I needed. Amber didn't take it well. She'd underestimated me, assumed I'd just quietly disappear from her life and let her keep the house, the kids, and the carefully constructed lie she called a family. When she was served the papers, she showed up at Mark's place that same evening, pounding on the door. "Let me in!" she shouted, her voice shaking with anger. I didn't answer. Mark opened the door just enough to tell her to leave, his tone calm but firm. "He doesn't want to talk to you," Mark said, his body blocking the doorway like a fortress. Amber tried every trick in the book. Tears, apologies, even accusations that I was abandoning the kids. But I stayed inside, silent and unmoving. When she finally left, her screams echoing down the street, I collapsed onto the couch, my hands trembling. It wasn't victory. It was survival. In court, the evidence was damning. Andrew presented the overheard conversation, the timeline inconsistencies, and the results of the DNA tests. The tests confirmed what I already knew in my gut. Lily and Noah weren't mine. Amber's lawyer tried to paint her as a struggling mother who made mistakes, but Andrew dismantled their arguments with cold precision. He showed the court how she'd manipulated me, used me as a financial crutch, and lied to everyone around her. I sat there, numb, as the judge ruled in my favor. Amber was ordered to leave the house within 30 days, and I was granted restitution for the financial support I'd provided under false pretenses. The judge didn't mince words, calling Amber's actions deceptive and cruel. But there was no joy in winning. Watching her break down in the courtroom didn't feel like justice. It felt like the end of something I'd once cherished. The aftermath was a mess. Amber moved in with her parents, who were less than thrilled about the situation. She lost her social circle, her reputation, and the life she'd built on my back. I heard through mutual friends that she tried to find a job, but her lack of work experience and the stain of the court case made it difficult. For the first time in years, Amber wasn't in control, and she didn't handle it well. But none of that brought me peace. After the dust settled, I found myself in a house that no longer felt like a home. The rooms were too quiet, too empty without the kids' laughter or the sound of Amber bustling around. I'd walk into the living room and half expect to see Lily curled up with her stuffed giraffe or Noah building another model car. But they weren't there. I'd spent so much time fighting to expose Amber's lies that I hadn't prepared for what came next. The emptiness. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself sinking into a routine that was as lifeless as I felt. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, and sit in silence. The hobbies I once loved, reading, fixing up my car, even watching movies, held no appeal. Mark tried to help, dragging me out for drinks or inviting me over to watch the game, but I couldn't muster the energy to care. "You need to move on," he'd say, his voice full of concern. "I'm fine," I'd reply, even though we both knew it wasn't true. One night, I sat in the dining room, a bottle of whiskey on the table and a stack of old family photos in front of me. There we were, smiling at Lily's 3rd birthday party. At the park, Noah on my shoulders. Amber laughing as she leaned against me. It hit me like a freight train. I'd built my entire life around a lie. The love, the sacrifices, the dreams of growing old together. It had all been for nothing. I felt broken, not just by Amber's betrayal but by the loss of the life I thought I had. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just empty. I stopped caring about work, barely putting in the effort to keep up appearances. My boss noticed, offering me time off or someone to talk to, but I brushed him off. What was the point? Nothing mattered anymore. Friends and family reached out, but their words felt hollow. "You'll find someone new," they'd say, or "you're better off without her." But I wasn't looking for someone new, and I didn't feel better off. I was adrift, untethered from the life I'd known. Amber may have lost her house, her reputation, and her stability, but I'd lost something far deeper. My sense of self. Winning the battle had cost me everything I was. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know how to put the pieces back together. It didn't happen all at once. Healing rarely does. There was no grand epiphany, no light bulb moment where everything clicked back into place. Instead, it was a series of small, almost imperceptible steps that slowly pulled me out of the fog I'd been living in for months. The first step came from Mark, though at the time I hated him for it. One Saturday morning, he barged into my house unannounced, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "What are you doing?" I asked, groggy and irritated. "You're coming with me," he said matter-of-factly, dumping the bag on the couch. "To where?" "Doesn't matter," he said. "Anywhere but here. You've been sitting in this house for months. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Letting it swallow you whole. Not today. Get dressed." I wanted to argue, to tell him to leave me alone, but something about the look on his face stopped me. Reluctantly, I threw on a pair of jeans and followed him out the door. We ended up at a hiking trail about an hour outside the city. It was cold, the kind of crisp autumn morning that bites at your skin and makes you question why you ever left the comfort of your bed. But as we walked, something unexpected happened. For the first time in months, I felt lighter. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot, the clean scent of pine trees, the wind brushing against my face. It all felt like a reminder that the world hadn't stopped turning just because mine had. Mark didn't say much during the hike, and I was grateful for it. He let me exist in that moment, surrounded by nature, without the burden of conversation or expectations. When we reached the top of the trail, He handed me a thermos of coffee and said, "You're going to be okay, you know?" I didn't respond, but deep down, a small part of me wanted to believe him. After that, I started taking more walks, venturing out of the house even when I didn't have a reason to. At first, it was just to the park or around the neighborhood. Then it became longer drives to places I hadn't been in years, quiet lakes, old hiking spots, even the beach. Each trip felt like a small victory, a way of reclaiming pieces of myself that I'd lost along the way. The next step came from my sister, Emily. She called me one evening and, without preamble, said, "You're coming to dinner." "I'm not in the mood," I replied. "Tough," she said. "Be here at 6. Emily had always been the persistent one in the family, and this time was no different. I showed up at her house reluctantly, expecting an evening of awkward small talk and pitying looks. Instead, I found myself surrounded by laughter and warmth. Her kids clung to me, begging me to play board games with them. Her husband handed me a beer and talked to me about football like nothing had happened. Emily herself kept the conversation light, steering it away from Amber and the divorce entirely. For a few hours, I felt normal again. I felt like part of something bigger than my pain. Over the following months, I started to rebuild my routines. I went back to work, throwing myself into projects with a determination I hadn't felt in years. I signed up for a woodworking class at a local community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. First, it was awkward. I was rusty, out of practice when it came to socializing and focusing on something other than my grief. But as the weeks went by, I found myself looking forward to those classes, to the simple satisfaction of creating something with my hands. Therapy was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't easy. I'd spent years bottling up my emotions, convincing myself that I didn't need help. But after some gentle nudging from Mark and Emily, I made an appointment. My therapist, a kind but no-nonsense woman named Rachel, didn't let me off the hook. She pushed me to confront the anger, the sadness, the sense of betrayal that had been eating away at me. "You can't change what happened," she said during one session, "but you can choose what you do with it. Do you want to let it define you, or do you want to grow from it?" At first, I didn't have an answer, but over time, I realized I didn't want to be the man Amber's betrayal had made me. I didn't want to live in bitterness or let her choices dictate my future. The turning point came one morning when I woke up and realized I wasn't thinking about Amber anymore. The pain was still there, a dull ache rather than a sharp stab, but it wasn't all-consuming. For the first time in what felt like forever, I thought about the future, and it didn't feel so bleak. It's been 2 years now since the divorce. I won't lie and say everything is perfect. There are still moments when the memories creep in, uninvited and unwelcome. But they don't control me anymore. I've built a life I'm proud of, a life that's mine. I've reconnected with old friends, traveled to places I'd always dreamed of visiting, and even started dating again. It's slow and cautious, but it feels good to let myself hope again. Amber's betrayal broke me, but it didn't destroy me. Piece by piece, I've rebuilt myself into someone stronger, someone who knows his worth. And for the first time in a long time, I can honestly say I'm happy. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.